Hello and welcome to the Rubber Duck Dev Show. I'm Chris,
I'm Kristen.
and tonight we're gonna two topics we're gonna try to squeeze into the show. One of them is top-down versus bottom-up testing. If you don't know what that is, we'll kind of define what we mean by that when we get into it. And the other one is should you soft delete? So before we get into all that stuff, Kristen, how was your week?
Pretty busy again. Doing a fair amount of consulting, a lot of consulting work that I'm working on. And unfortunately, some of my stuff I need to be doing for my app is not keeping up as much as I want to, or I want to push it more forward, things faster than they're happening now. But it's kind of like with the consulting, it's kind of like, well, if it's available, go ahead and book it and do it now to have the revenue and then
Yeah.
use the revenue for other things. What about you?
Um, since we're heading towards end of the year and getting a couple of weeks away from our code freeze, trying to get our final production releases out and get all the little things tied down for the end of the year. So it's just been a lot of little nitnoid crossing I's, dotting T's kind of week, that kind of thing. So actually hasn't been too stressful or too complicated. It's just been very busy because it's like, just tons of little things flying around. But we're on a good trajectory to get everything where it needs to be in the time it needs to be there. So feeling pretty good about that.
Cool.
All right. So bottom up versus top down testing. So you brought this idea up for the show, and so I'll let you define what you mean by that. I think I know what you mean, but
yeah, we never actually talked about it. I just sent an email. You said, "Oh, excuse me, a text." You said, "Sounds good."
Yep.
And we never discussed it until the second.
Right. So brand new
So
conversation.
my interpretation of what I meant by that is basically a UI first is what I kind of mean by top down, or integration test first. Like if you're using Ruby on Rails, maybe you're writing a heaven forbid a cucumber spec, or something in our spec that basically uses something like capybara. So you're literally simulating a browser of some sort to step through what you want the app to do. And bottom up is what I meant by that, is basically unit tests. So basically you start from, hey, I want to build this functionality. First, I'm going to create this class and these methods, and then arising from that comes the UI somehow. And I say it that way because I'm a bit biased on how I do things. So that's what my interpretation, or what I meant by that.
Yeah, and interestingly, I think this will be a decent conversation because interestingly, you and I are on opposite ends of this spectrum for how we approach testing. So, I don't think either one of us would say you use one or the other at the exclusion of the other one, right?
And I actually start, top down or UI, but I then quickly switch to unit tests, and then I go back. So it's more of a,
Yeah.
you'll find out as we get more into the details, it's more like that as opposed to, do everything at once.
Right. And I'm more of a let me start testing the individual bricks and then I'll put them together into the bigger, higher level tests. So I usually start from the bottom end. That's what I would consider bottom up.
Yeah.
So, all right. So, what do you have to say about that?
So generally now I don't do a lot of greenfield projects anymore. I do on occasion. But like so much of in my consulting, so much of the code bases I'm accessing have been around for a while. But generally, if I would do a greenfield application, or how I've done them in the past, is that I generally start with a integration test, a UI based test, and I say, all right, what's the first thing I want to build? Basically, first thing people generally see is a login. All right, so I need logins. Well, in order to do logins, I need signups. All right, so that's actually what I start testing. If I have free reign to build the system as I would say, all right, sounds like the first thing I need is a sign up system. So then I define, okay, how you doing, Colin?
Get going.
So then I define, okay, what is the UI, what information is needed, and then I start writing the test to say, all right, this is what I'm looking for. But then very quickly, at the point at which I start adding business logic into my, say, controller or whatever, then I'm like, all right, put this in a method somewhere, and now start the unit testing to test all the different variations of that to see, make sure it succeeds and it doesn't fail, yeah, all the different failure states that needed to be checked. So that's what I meant. I do start from the UI's perspective, but then once I get to the point where I start needing to worry about business logic, then I kind of flip into a unit testing mode.
Yeah.
That's
So
how I generally do it.
I mean that thinking approach is usually what I take in the design. I'll start at the top from a design level when I'm designing a project. So I usually do that thinking in my design phase. But by the time I get to my testing phase, I'm starting to think about, okay, how is this little component supposed to work? Let me get that all working right. I will say that I have seen benefits to both approaches in that starting with a top-down approach like you do, you you don't get bogged down in the details of something that may not be useful once you get it into the full thing. Usually I find that as a problem and need to take the the top down approach to testing if I haven't done much in the way of design work. And I'm not talking about ridiculous amounts of detailed design. I'm just talking we have a general idea of what this thing is going to do, how things are generally going to look, and what features are going to be in it. Um, so I
Now,
think
when you, sorry, go ahead.
um, I, I I think that the difference in how you approach design will have a significant impact on what the best way is to approach testing.
Now, now when you're saying design, what does that mean to you? Because some people may hear it and think the visual design. Some people may think the database design. Some people may think how your classes are being arranged and what's storing data. What do you mean by design?
Well, so what I mean is I'm not talking about the aesthetic things. I'm talking about wireframing. How are things going to connect? What is this app going to do? How is the
You mean
user
like
flow going
mock-ups
to
or not
work?
necessarily?
I mean, to a point, but I'll just start with a piece of paper and a pencil and start drawing little squares and saying, okay, I think it should have this kind of screen and that should go to this kind of screen. Kind of like what is the user flow in the product?
Okay, so it's like it's a mock-up of what a user would see.
Yeah, just
Okay.
not very
Yeah.
fancy one. And at that
Well,
point,
that's a mock-up. It's not supposed to
yeah,
be
yeah.
fancy.
And I want, I rarely think about the aesthetics of this at all until I get well into the testing phase and I'm already doing, got things up and running in my local server and stuff.
Well, no, I was 90% confident that's what you meant by design, but
Yeah.
in case people were hearing this, I didn't they some people may think, "Hey, user interface," not
Well,
user interface,
and
but
it depends.
aesthetic design.
Right. And
So,
and I think I approach it that way because I'm mostly a back end developer. Front end developers, when they say design, are typically talking a lot about where are we going to put these things on the screen? How are they going to look? What colors are we going to use? They are talking about the aesthetics when they say that. So I think that's a good distinction. Colin says, I typically have a similar flow as you, Creston, but it does depend on what I know already about what I need or want to build going into it. So, yeah, I mean, that's agreed. I think that's right. And I think most developers that I've seen anyway tend to start with a top-down design like you. I'm a bit odd in that respect, I think, in the general. Seems to be most people don't approach it the way I do, but that's my brain just works better that way, thinking about the little bits.
Yeah. And I'm not even talking about the phase of where, because even before that, starting that approach, before I start coding, I think through the database side of things, the data side of things. All right, what kind of tables am I going to be needing? And it's not that I build those first necessarily, but I like having it scoped out kind of at least at a first pass of what I think I'm going to need, which tables where the data is going to be stored even before I, you know, start that. And then as I go through the process and set up, say, the sign up system and then get a login system, as things bubble up and say, oh, I needed to do this, well, then that needs, then I'll need to make changes to the database plan I had. Yeah, it's a
Right.
plan that is, of course, subject to change. So when do you think about the data and where it's being stored in the data tables? Is that like prior to you starting, or is it along
That's
with your design phase, or?
it's usually part of my design process, but it's not really thinking about tables per se as much as defining the models that or the classes that I'll have, which I mean kind of essentially is the same thing at that point. Um, but yeah, I do that as part of my design, and that's a lot of times one of the very early things I will do is I've got this concept for a project and I kind of know I've kind of thought through what my flows are going to be and what kind of things it needs. So let me start defining my models of what it's going to take to support those. And then I'll figure out, okay, how are those models going to flow, right? And start drawing my silly little squares and crap piece of paper at that point. So yeah, I'm usually defining the data structure pretty early on. Uh, For example, if I had to add a column to an existing model, I will do unit tests first before I start working that new piece into the UI, doing more integration tests. Yeah, yeah, that makes sense, Colin. Um, yeah, because once the thing is out of greenfield status, um, I think most people tend to go more to unit testing because they're trying to tackle a specific bug or a specific new feature or a specific problem, and so they're just writing tests around this little bit. Um, at least
I
more
still,
so.
I see, I still tend to do my UI tests first, though, with that, even with that.
Yeah, well, you're
But
weird,
that's
so
that's
I don't.
just me.
No,
It's
I
like this
think
thing
that's
needs a toggle. Okay, test that there's a toggle, and
right,
when you toggle it, something should happen. I'm like, okay, well then,
right. Well, and
that's
see,
me.
I think, and again, I think that's probably more common than the way I do it. But what I do with my tests is I actually do test-driven development, where I start with the little thing and say, okay, now tell me what the next thing is I need to do, and I let my tests kind of lead me through. You have to be a little careful with that because you don't want your tests driving your design. You want them driving your development, which is a bit of a hair splitting point, but it's, I think, important. Um, but, it, I like to kind of let my tests kind of lead me along to the next thing I got to do, because then I don't have to think about the mechanics of what I've got to put in place. I can think about keep my eye on the end goal of where I'm trying to get, I guess is what I'm saying.
Now, what do you mean the mechanics, and how are the tests driving?
Well, okay, so you have to make this you don't have this controller action. Okay, you don't have this view. Okay, you don't have this partial. Okay, you don't have this config. Okay, you don't have, this class name. And I just let it worry about all those mechanical things so I can concentrate on pushing things forward and thinking through the next steps, which now that I'm saying that, it sounds like I think top down would be more useful in that respect.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
However, that hasn't been my experience. When I start with top down, I end up spending more time thinking about the mechanics and working myself backwards than if I start at the bottom up.
Now, what does the process of bottom up mean to you? Like, sorry, I'm put you on the spot here, but can you think of a feature and like, all right, how do you start from a bottom up approach?
Well, usually what I'll do, so for example, um, like I said in my design phase, I'll start defining my classes, what classes I need. I'll need a user. I'll need um, an order. I'll need a line item. I'll need, these things. Then I go through those and I say, okay, which of these classes do I want to start with? Which is kind of one of the building blocks. Now, what do I want this class to do? And then I'll start testing that. And then I'll say, okay, now I need to start thinking about how this other class is going to link to this one. So what does this other class need to do, and how are they going to talk to each other? And so that's kind of my bottom up approach, is I kind of start at a class level and work my way into systems of classes.
Okay.
So how do you do it with the top down?
Well, I mean, I think I described it. I basically work until the point of like the request, the feature request is being able to log in. Okay, well, then need to present a form. And then, all right, now it's time to submit the form. Well, now we got to do authentication. So, what does that mean? So, then at that point, I switch to essentially unit tests because I want to create a very simple API or interface for, in the controller to be able to authenticate someone, either use a PORO or put it in the user model, even though people tend to not like that or whatever. But basically, put the authentication there and then unit test that to make sure it does what's expected. And then that essentially will lead the login to work from the user interface level.
So as I'm kind of listening to you and I describe these things, one of the things I'm starting to think of is test duplication, or having the same function tested many places through your test suite, is a significant problem in a lot of code bases, right? Because especially if you've got multiple developers, but even if you only have one developer, what ends up happening is it grows into I'm retesting the same thing over and over because I'm trying to test this other little thing that sits under it, right? But I have to test all this stuff to get to this part. I'm wondering if one of these ways um, lends itself to limiting that more than the other. And I don't know that I have an answer, but I'm just wondering if one of these can say, okay, I've gotten to a point where I've already tested this bit, so I don't need to test that again. I can just mock that or stub it out.
Yeah, I mean, I find myself being frustrated by that and constantly trying to not test too much on the UI perspective. Again, because the UI tests are slower than molasses. So I basically just want to do the happy path and then like one failure state. And then, but that necessarily gets duplicated in the unit test. Like if I'm checking authentication, I want to make sure that a successful authentication happens and an unsuccessful authentication happens from the UI to be able to see different messages that okay, this failed. Um, or I get the flow of did the authentication succeed or did it not? So I want those in the UI, and then the unit tests handle all the different failure cases that are possible with authentication. But I also want a successful test of that, specific method. So yeah, there is, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's always going to be some duplication between
Sure.
unit test and, but I guess the key is trying to avoid too much duplication within a segment of tests. Like, don't test the same integration or UI test multiple times, and don't unit test the same thing multiple times if you can.
Yeah. I find myself running into that particular issue, the duplication issue, more in my integration side tests than in my unit side tests. Because what ends up happening for me is that to do this integration test, I'm basically full stacking it, which means I've got to do all the login stuff. I've got to set up all these
Yeah.
behind the scenes things and the cookies and all that crap. And then I go to test this other screen or this other feature, and I have to do all the same crap again. And it gets to a point where, okay, I should probably mock a lot of this stuff, but at some point I need to test it. So which one should I test it in? And then it just feels uneven to me and blows my OCD up. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
so I'm just,
I can see that.
I'm not, and to be fair, I do integration tests. I mean, I don't think you should only do one or the other. I think they're both important. Um, and I think what we're really talking about is the order in which you do those things.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I just wonder if, because that's a constant problem in code bases I run into and code bases I write. I mean, I have that problem and I'm aware of the problem. I just haven't figured out a good way to stop it yet, without massive amounts of effort. I mean, if I spent all my time doing tests and never actually wrote any code, I'm sure I could control that. But at some point, you got to actually write code, or the tests are meaningless. Um, but I'm just wondering if one of those methodologies has a benefit to that, helps control that more. I don't know, chat. What do you think? Or leave some comments in here if you're watching later. How do you control your code, your test duplication, especially in the integration side, because those tend to be worse about duplication because they're full stacking it. Um,
Well, and just expensive too.
yeah, yeah,
So if you have duplication, that's where you want to avoid it at all costs.
exactly. Yeah, unit tests. If I duplicate a couple of methods, method tests or method calls, fine, because they're 25 milliseconds each, but it can get really bad. So anyway, any final thoughts on the top down versus bottom up?
Well, trying to think if I don't think so. I mean, I think I have an idea of how now, so I can understand that. All right, so you have a new feature that has come in. You need to maybe add a new class, a new methods, and basically you start structuring it from there and not touching the UI as of yet necessarily.
Right.
Is that correct? So you basically put that in and then you layer the UI on top and start your integration test at that point.
Yeah,
Once your unit tests are passing and you have the structure that you want in terms of classes and methods, etc.
pretty much. I mean, I will kind of switch back and forth. Like I'll there will be an area of the app where I'll do all the unit and class testing I need to do to get those bits together, and then build it up to the integration tests, and
Okay.
then go to another area where I can work on some. But I save the front end stuff to last because I want the mechanics of the program to be independent of the presentation of the program. I don't want to be thinking about how is this going to look when I'm thinking about how is it going to work, if that makes sense.
Well,
I mean,
As a
yes, to a
counterpoint,
point.
how it works is basically UX design or user experience.
Well, it depends on what part of the program you're talking about. I mean, fair point, but um, I'm talking about when I'm, my models and stuff, how they interoperate, how the classes talk to each other, where their barriers are, um, what the logic and programming flows are. To me, are independent of what the user flow necessarily
Sure.
is,
Sure.
right?
Yeah, that's a different consideration compared to yeah, the
Yeah.
user flow
And my
or the
brain just likes
user experience.
right. My brain just likes to think of the mechanical flow first, and then I'll lay on the user flow on top of that because I can then just take the user flow off and put a different user flow on if I want to. Not to say that I think that the other way of thinking doesn't have value. Thinking about how is the user going to use this can dictate a lot of times how you need to build the mechanics, but that's not typically how my brain wants to flow with it. So anyway,
Okay.
all right. So that's one topic down. Let's talk about the other fun one, and this is something that's actually relevant to my recent work life because I just had to fight with some of this.
Oh boy.
Should you soft delete? Now let's first define soft delete. What that means is you've got records in your data, and rather than when somebody wants to get rid of a record, you actually delete it from your data. That's a hard delete. With a soft delete, you usually have like something like a field called deleted at. That's kind of like your updated at and created at. And you stamp that field and then just filter those things out. Right? That's a soft delete. I don't actually get rid of the record. I just filter it out of everything.
You mark it as being deleted
Right.
by putting a date time in the deleted app.
Right. And I think so. I've seen a number of ways to do this. 95% of them are you put a deleted at date stamp in there so that you can track when was this deleted, and that point is going to be important later in this discussion, and some of the things that I've run into in real life. But I've also seen things that are just kind of like a Boolean flag: active, inactive, deleted, not deleted. I think the best approach is a date time stamp if you're going to do soft deletion. Now, before we get deep into the discussion, I just want to see if chat has any opinions on should you soft delete stuff or should you just hard delete it when you're dealing with apps, especially if you're dealing with high volume apps. So one of the things that I will say is that I think that answer largely depends on how big your database is going to get. Hey, Rick, welcome to the show.
Howdy. Howdy.
So if I'm never going to have very much volume in my database, soft deletion, I think, is a safer route to go. Because if I goof something up, I can always just get that record back by, nulling out the deleted at field. That's simple. If I hard delete stuff, I've got to go to backups to get those records back for the most part, unless I'm doing an archive system or something like that. Problem you run into is when you have large data volumes. And the biggest issue with that is it's kind of, so I think Rick is getting on this right now. I do like soft delete, but I'm concerned about performance when you delete A, which has many B, which has many C, which in turn has many D. Exactly. You get a kind of a progression of exponential growth in your data. And if you're only hiding the top level record, you've essentially, not technically correct, but you have essentially orphaned all the hang off records from that. Um, not from a database
Or
perspective, because the
worse,
record's just there, but
generally, this is something done in the Rails app, whereas the database can still see everything.
right,
So if
exactly.
you're typically how it's set up is you can do any queries you want and still get all the data, even the quote unquote deleted data, and it's the Rails app that misses it. Well, now how do you handle again these child records of this record that's deleted? Do you soft delete the children as well so it doesn't show up in the Rails app or not? Yeah,
And
it brings up all sorts of questions.
that is specifically one of the two big problems I just ran into with soft delete. And that was we soft deleted this thing that is connected to another thing. When you look at the global list of things, the thing doesn't show up because it's soft deleted. But if you look at the category of things, the thing shows up because the category isn't soft deleted that it belongs to.
Right.
So that caused massive confusion for some of the customers that were using that functionality. And it was because of the soft deletion. And when you do that, it's necessary to make sure that you go through and filter everywhere that can be. And if you miss a place, things are going to go weird. So if you're going to soft delete, you better know everywhere that's going to show up, and you better be really thorough with your filtering on that. So that's one significant issue with soft deletes. Now, that being said, I don't want it to come across as I'm trying to advocate you should never soft delete, always hard delete your stuff. I don't believe that. There are times when you want to soft delete, especially with things like users. I think that's a case where you almost always want to soft delete, at least at first. Because the other big problem with soft deletes is database performance. Because if you're never getting rid of records that aren't being used, and you're never cleaning up your database and doing the vacuums and stuff, your indexes are going to get ridiculously huge. Your searches are going to get insanely slow, and your database size is going to grow out of control. And then what you're going to end up doing, which I've run into, is your database causes you to have to buy more infrastructure just to house the size of your database, and 3/4 of your records are soft deleted. So you're wasting a crap ton of money, right? And also your search times and your user experience goes down the toilet. So performance is the other big consideration when you're thinking about soft deleting. Should you never soft delete if you have very high volume databases? No. But if you're going to soft delete in high volume, I would highly recommend that you have some kind of sunsetting procedure where once this record has been soft deleted for 90 days or 120 days or whatever, we go through and hard delete it. We have a process that runs every night that hard deletes in the background. Or we have a process that goes in and moves that off to an archive table so it's not in the main table anymore.
So just to comment on something you said, anything that's going to be deleting up to 3/4 of the table, like you mentioned, so like a quarter of active data and 3/4 of it's deleted, I wouldn't even use a deleted app for that use case.
No, nor would I. I mean, you do need to think
I,
about the
I
use
think that
cases.
particular
Yeah.
use case, if you're going to be know you're going to be deleting a lot of data, I wouldn't use this. I would like how I've used it, like in my own app, is as a rescue measure when users do something that they want to take back
Right.
pretty easily. So,
Control
like for
Z, Control
example,
Z.
exactly. Like for example, um, mine app does online giving, and the form I set up as a soft delete, and all of the gifts coming in are linked to that form. Now, The soft deletion allows that form to be deleted. Now that form is no longer available. You can't make GIFs through it. But if someone does that by accident, like, oh my gosh, our form is down, can go in and easily reverse that soft deletion and hey, everything's working again. But even if I were to delete it, I actually never delete the GIFs no matter what. They're always there unless there's spam related issues. But and I don't have like a cascade delete set up in the Rails application or in the database for that because I want people to be able to delete old forms, but the actual transactions that have come through them will persist and are independent. So in that use case, I don't need to worry about, oh my gosh, what do you do with the children? Because I've already
Right.
established they need to stay.
Yeah.
So I think that, not to say that this is a good or acceptable use case, but it's one that decision I made a few years ago that, seems to be working. And it's exceedingly rare. I think I've only had to use it. So I built out this feature, taking time to do that. Now, granted, it's not that hard to do, but I think I've used it once, maybe twice in over 5 years. So it's kind of like, do you even need this feature is another question.
Yeah, but I'm gonna guess that that once or twice was, oh, thank God I had this.
Well, yeah, well, what you would do as an alternative, because there's actually a post that actually prompted my suggestion talking about this.